Psychology, welcome to the psychology of memory. In this lecture, we will understand more of how you encode and store and retrieve memories. And those are the three steps involved in how you remember things. So, as always, let's define terms. Memory is a system that senses, organizes, alters, stores, and retrieves information. So if you look at the entire process, let's say you go to a party and you're introduced to someone. First, you need to sense them, meaning you have to see their face, hear their voice. Then you have to organize that information. Maybe they have a name that is similar to someone else that you've known in the past. So you're familiar with that name, but they have a unique story and they have a unique identity, and you're organizing all of this. Now, your brain does alter information. Our memories are not perfect. Sometimes we hear someone else give an account of the same party, for instance, and they have a different take, and maybe these memories can be adjusted both to be more accurate. Also, we can fall prey to misinformation. Information after the fact can sometimes interfere with our memories. But we store this, and let's say we see this person a year later, and we've met them, and we retrieve the information. Let's say we do remember their name and their story and their identity, and therefore that's the complete cycle. Now, our memories are not always perfect. In fact, they are not perfect almost all the time, and some people have a gift of a better memory than others. But we can all improve in the memory that we have. So we're going to look at a three-step process of memory, and my goal here, as always, is to be practical and to help you improve your storage and retrieval of information for tests. I think there's some just very simple memory tricks that we're going to learn in this lesson and understand the science behind it. So, encoding is converting environmental and mental stimuli into memorable brain codes. The process of seeing something, hearing something, touching something, tasting something, or even thinking something can be encoded and converted. The storage is the holding on of this information. We have to organize it. Your brain is like a filing cabinet, and the more organized this mental filing cabinet is, the better you will store and retrieve information. The retrieval is just the pulling information out. Sometimes we can think of the name of a song or the name of a person or lines from a movie. We can remember them sometimes a lot better than the things that we have to memorize for school, and we'll understand more about why that is the case. So we're going to look, there's different models of memory. We're going to concentrate on the information processing model. The information processing model, I'm going to skip over the parallel distributed, not that those are not important, but for the sake of time, as well as the levels of processing. I think the information processing model kind of demands most of our time because I think it's a very simplistic way of helping you immediately to improve your memory. So you can divide your memory process into three parts. Sensory, that's when you pick up the environmental codes. You then move this to short-term memory, and then eventually to long-term memory. Think of sensory memory as the first stage, the point at which information enters the nervous system through the sensory systems. Think of it as a door that is open for a brief time. Looking through the door, one can see many people and objects. But only some of these people and objects will actually make it through the door itself. From every text message you see, from every tweet or Instagram post, or every snap, or every television program, or every YouTube video, or even every tree you pass on the way to school, or every bird that flies over, there are literally billions of opportunities, billions of doors that open up, and and billions of potential things to focus on. So your brain is constantly weeding out the things that are not important, and what is not important to you would be super important to someone else. So these are really billions of very micro decisions, very split-second decisions your brain makes in terms of our sensory memory. Now, the main pattern of sensory memory is pattern recognition. So your brain is recognizing patterns, visual patterns and auditory patterns. So an icon would be a visual pattern, and if it's a pattern that you're familiar with, that you're keying in on a lot, then you're going to pay attention to it. If it's a sound, or the sound of someone's voice, right, the timbre of someone's voice becomes familiar to you, and your brain then keys in on these things that are important. So the capacity of your sensory memory is large, but it's not unlimited. You've heard of individuals with a photographic memory. You think of photographic memory as someone who basically takes a sensory memory and handles that differently than most people. Most of us weed out the majority of these icons and echoes. So with a short-term memory, once there are certain icons and echoes that we key in on, then our brain manipulates these. So with every icon that you see, your brain is actually rotating them 360 degrees. So the processing is instantaneous. Also with the echoes that you hear, these are auditory messages that you hear coming in through your ear, and the auditory cortex, if you will, has to filter these. It has to filter out a lot of the background noise. And so the finished product, that which you hear and understand, is not what it would be if your auditory cortex wasn't working. Now, once you hear and see things and pay attention to them, the attention process is like a funnel, and we give more energy to processing the information that's most important, and we funnel out things that are not. So this encoding process that takes place in the short-term memory, you could think of this as a visual and auditory sketch pad. Think of sticky notes. All right, what is a sticky note? It is a short-term visual sketch pad. You write something to think of, and then you throw it away. And same thing for your auditory short-term memory. Is kind of like if someone were to give you a phone number and you were repeating this in your mind over and over, that's a phonological loop. And we use the sketch pad and the loop in order to hold on to them, in order to temporarily process that information. So psychologists have measured the amount of space that you have, the amount of memory that you have, if you will. And researchers have collected an average. Most people have a magic number 7. You have about 7 bins of information. If somebody were to give you a 7-digit phone number and you repeated this in your phonological loop over and over, then you could hold on to it. Likewise, if someone gave you a 7-digit number and you were to visualize it in your mind, you could hold on to that. But this can be expanded through chunking. So for instance, for years I have given students a digit span test in class. Now, a digit span test is a test of short-term memory by which we give individuals different numbers. So I usually go with a 14-digit number. And when students hear all the numbers, they even get overwhelmed. But if you can learn, it's a skill of dividing them into twos, then you can hold on to that a little bit better. You have about 12 to 30 seconds through something called maintenance rehearsal when you're bringing this over in your mind. And so the take home here is note taking. After a teacher gives you some kind of information in a lecture, you have about 12 to 30 seconds before your brain moves that over. If you have some knowledge base on what the teacher is talking about, then it expands because you're simply connecting new information to old. You're already moving it into a filing cabinet of your long-term memory. So I want to ask you to think about this. How can you perfect the art of note-taking? I have some students who try to write down everything that they see in a PowerPoint lecture. And when they're doing that, they're not hearing anything that I'm saying. So the key is to manage your short-term memory. What I mean is, it's very skilled person, a skilled student who can manage their short-term memory as it's happening. So we're talking about efficient thinkers. If you realize that you only have about 12 or 30 seconds to grasp the point that the teacher is communicating, then you can do this and not get so sidetracked in concentrating and writing down exactly what they say. And this takes some cognitive skill. Now, when we talk about long-term memory, this is the third stage of memory. And this system is one in which information is placed to be kept more or less permanently. The name long-term memory says it all. There's a physical change in your brain that happens. This is called a memory trace or an engram. But when a memory trace is formed, it's there. Now, if you don't access this in time, they fade. So once you have taken notes and once you understand the concept, the key here is just to go back and review your notes. And we can talk about how quickly long-term memories fade, but basically you have two types of rehearsal. Once you take your notes, you could go over them in terms of rote rehearsal. Those are my students who are taking human A&P, for instance, and they're learning all of the muscles, bones, joints. Then they simply go over these and over them and over them and over them. And this is rote memory. You're not necessarily elaborating your thought. Elaborative rehearsal, however, is when you are spending time. You might want to think of this as rumination or meditation, or when you're really thinking deep on issues that you're trying to remember. So, for instance, people will come up with very unique ways of creating mnemonics. A mnemonic device is something to help you remember. People will take a song that they know and they will change the lyrics to be the things that they're trying to memorize. Now, you have different types of long-term memory. You have the procedural memory, and a lot of this is stored in your cerebellum, also in your motor cortex. And the procedural memory is something like tying the shoes, right? Tying your shoes, walking, riding a bike. This is different than declarative memory. Now, the declarative memory are things you declare. So learning your name, learning how old you are, right? What's your parents' anniversary, but also facts about school. These are the semantic memories. The episodic memories are those which really fade less. These are things from your childhood. These are memories from school, hanging out with your friends, good and bad episodic memories. And the ones that are really more meaningful to us are the episodic. Now, the semantic memory can be improved. And when we're talking about doing well in school, a lot of times we're talking about the semantic. But my challenge for students is to blend them. There are a group of people who sit around at lunch at high school and they talk about what they're learning. And there's a four-letter word. You might be thinking I'm saying nerds, right? Actually, the four-letter word I'm thinking of is rich, because these are successful people and they're passionate about learning and they love learning, and eventually they're very successful. So the idea here is if we can somehow take what we're learning and have conversations about them. I had a professor once who said when he could look in the mirror and teach himself about the test, then he knew he was ready. I prefer this way of doing it. When you can teach someone else well, when you can tutor someone, you're ready to take the test. And so a very simple strategy is to sit down at dinner with your family and tell them what you're learning in school and be as detailed and descriptive as possible. Because what that does is that really cements the content in your long-term memory. So when we think about memory, oftentimes this leads us to another topic, which is forgetting. So inevitably, we do need to talk about not only how we process information, but how and why does it happen that we forget. Forgetting is basically a failure to store information well. You can't retrieve it well because you didn't store it correctly. So if we understand how our brains encode and store and retrieve, then we can be more effective in retrieving. So let's look at retrieval cues. Your brain is very specific in how it encodes information. So encoding specificity is something that psychologists have studied. And what they have discovered is that our brains key things in according to time of day, location, and the environment. If you are learning information in a certain environment, when you're back in that environment, it will stimulate this. So some of you, for instance, if you had occasion to go into your elementary school after not being there for 15 years, if you were to walk into that school, a rush of memories or feelings may come to light. And so these are what we would call context-dependent retrieval cues. Certain times of year when it's cool outside, and we start having all kinds of memories that come up. Certain locations, we haven't been there in a long time. And so the way this translates is that it's really good to study in a very similar place to where you're going to be taking the test. The same time of day. Also, there's not just context, but there's also state-dependent learning. If you're happy when you're studying, then if you're in a similar emotional, physiological state, that should help. Whether it's an internal state, whether it's an emotional state or physiological state. So there's a famous study by Godden and Badley in 1975, and they had people submerged underwater with scuba gear. What they found is that when they're learning things underwater, if they're recalling underwater, they do significantly better. If they learned on land, they would be better recalling it on land. So what's interesting here is that if we can approximate the environment that we are learning in when we're studying, if we can keep things kind of consistent, it should help some. In general, as you're studying, as we talk about study habits, it's a good idea to be well nourished when you're taking a test, but it's also a good idea to just be consistent in terms of your bedtime, getting enough rest, getting some exercise, and studying in a consistent environment. With recall, memories are retrieved with few or no external cues. So filling in the blanks on an application, that's recall. Recognition, on the other hand, would be like a multiple choice test. And so life is really more about recall. Now, there's some problems with recall, and there's some also problems with recognition. If I told you, would you rather a short answer test or a matching test, right? You probably would choose matching. But with recall, you know it when you can recall it. The problem here is something called tip of the tongue memory. One feels as though the information is known, but it's not retrievable. You can only generate bits of the information. So for instance, what we found through research is that individuals can usually communicate the meaning of a word and the syllables of the word and what the word starts with, but they can't actually give the word. There was a pretty famous study where college students learned a list of words, and sometime later they were brought back. They were given the definition, but not the word. They could tell you what the word started with and how many syllables, but they could not produce the word in many cases. So this tells us that this is one reason why you can remember kind of some general ideas about a person's name, but not remember their name. I get a lot of Steves. Well, that kind of makes sense. Name's Keith. They're both one syllable words with a long E sound. And that gives you an idea of kind of how our brains work. And so the idea to prevent this, we need to just to overlearn. We need to be very specific. If you want to remember what you're learning from college, it'd be a good idea to go back and look at your notes even after the course has ended, especially for the subjects that are in your major field. If you're a business major, you ought to occasionally go back and look at all your business notes because that keeps this in your mind, especially being able to have conversations about these topics. So with recognition, the problem then becomes something called the false positive. There's a guy named Bernard Pagano. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he was actually falsely identified for a series of robberies. Now, these robberies were eventually confessed to by another man, but he was found guilty. And the reason he was found guilty is because he ended up in a criminal lineup, and someone gave strong, confident assertion that he was the guy. Have you ever had this happen to you? Not that you've been falsely accused and been convicted of a felony you didn't commit, but really what I'm talking about is on a test. You may not really see it's not really a good comparison, but think about it in the sense that you've looked at a test before, you've seen question and you've seen the answers and you have been very confidently wrong. The key around this is we don't, when we use our recognition memory, this is a failure to store it correctly. Eyewitness testimony has been proven to have problems. So for instance, eyewitness testimony, there's Elizabeth Loftus in the protester study. She basically had research participants in her class, and she had individuals break into the class to protest. And then several weeks later, she asked questions about this protest, but she asked the questions to students in a misleading way. So she passed out a sheet and she said, when the 6 protesters came into the room, and she changed the number protesters. So in reality, there weren't 6. There might have been 5 or 7, but this just changing key details and embedding them in the question. Then she followed up sometime even later, and students remembered the event incorrectly. So details can be changed. Our memories are very susceptible because we're not always encoding the details, right? So encoding specificity is a problem. Also with flashbulb memories, here you have the Twin Towers on 9/11. A lot of people my age can remember where they were on September 11th, 2001. And here we see that flashbulb memories are an automatic encoding due to unexpected, highly emotional event. Research has drawn suspicion our memories can sometimes be fuzzy. So sometimes people will say, well, this song was on the radio when this terrible event happened. And these have been researched and studied. In terms of constructive memory processes, you have recall and recognition, and you also have reconstruction. Sometimes we can't remember all the details of an event, and so we kind of fill in the gaps. So for instance, if you go shopping in the grocery store every Saturday, and you always go to the very back and work your way to the front of the store, you do the same thing every time. If I ask where you were 2 years ago on a Saturday at 10 o'clock, you would say, I was at the grocery store because I go every single Saturday and I work from the back. Now, do you know specifically that 2 years ago on this date, on this Saturday, you were there, or are you filling in the gaps? You're probably filling in the gaps, unless you have some record, unless you're keeping very detailed records, which most people don't. And so our reconstruction can be fuzzy. There's also a misinformation effect. There have been studies about basically events that happen after the event that can affect our memory accuracy. You see individuals who witness a car accident, and the car accident involves a blue and a green car. And someone comes up after and tells the police it was 2 green cars. Right? Someone else says it's 2 blue cars. And perhaps you saw a blue and a green, but you're confused and you remember it incorrectly. Also, hypnosis, pseudo-memory syndrome. There's been a case, several cases, one case in particular that was thrown out of court. It was a young lady who accused her father of sexual abuse, and the conviction of the father was thrown out because the memories were uncovered during hypnosis. And research has essentially said that this occurred because memories were implanted. So when a person's hypnotized, it is possible for the hypnotist to implant false memories, and a person can really remember something as it happened, and even if it didn't happen. So hypnosis is not allowed as admissible evidence in court. So back to forgetting. I can remember freshman year of college having a test and walking into the test after studying for a lot of time, and I remember the class, I remember the teacher, and I had one item, and it was the last item, and I couldn't remember it. I was about to give in the test and give up. I thought to myself, I'm going to remember this as soon as I get out the door of this classroom. So I handed in my test, I gave up, I walked out the class, and the memory came to me. At that point, it was too late. So we all understand that this happens, but let's define forgetting not as a failure to retrieve, but let's define it as a failure to store information. when we fail to properly store information for future use, what happens is that we don't retrieve it well. And this oftentimes happens because of we don't go back and look at our notes. So this is the curve of forgetting, and I love this graph. Let's say you sit in on a lecture and you learn something and you understand it, you get it. Research shows that in 20 minutes, you will have lost 20% of that recall. In 1 hour, you'll lose about 50%. After 9 hours, 35. And then if you go down to a month later, and you may be taking a test on something you learned a month ago, that's a likely scenario, then you will have lost 90% of what you learned. The point here is that if you can get to the point where you're taking very effective notes, you will be better to go back and look at your notes as early as 20 minutes after the lecture. If you could take notes, walk to your next class, and before you start the next class, simply reviewing the notes, making sure they're legible, making sure it's a clear idea, just getting that back in your mind will prevent forgetting. If you looked at them again at the end of the day and again at the end of the week. So twice the day you learn them and once before the next week starts, you're going to find your recall will significantly improve. So forgetting can occur at sensory memory. So for instance, there's a famous research study that gives people 10 different counterfeit pennies. Excuse me, 9 counterfeit pennies and 1 real penny. Many people cannot get the correct penny because we don't study pennies. We don't study coins. Now, if you're a coin collector, you would know because you're rehearsing this, you're thinking about it, right? You know when different editions of coins come out. So most of us, however, we just see the change, we throw it on the counter, and we walk out. If you're not paying attention, if you're not taking detailed notes, then you won't encode and you won't store this long term. So encoding correctly in a class, this means taking notes and managing your attention, making sure that your phone is off, making sure that you're doing something to keep your mind. I mean, note taking is as much about keeping your mind focused as it is getting the information onto paper. Sometimes students will doodle and draw just to keep their minds from wandering, and they can listen that way. If you can doodle and draw about the things that you're learning, that would actually help you long term. Now, in terms of once the information is taken in your notes, you've got to minimize interference, which means you can confuse concepts. So the way around that is simply rehearsing it well and making sure that you have it organized and stored in your long-term memory filing cabinet. And finally, the way to prevent trace decay is simply to go back and think about things that are happening. So for instance, if you go back in your social media at your timeline, or if you go back and look at your old photos, if you go back and look at your own old events and posts, this will help keep things in your memory and will prevent trace decay. If you go back and look at your notes, go back and look at books. So 90% of our forgetting happens immediately. We don't pay attention. If your mind wanders, you won't remember anything the lecturer says. Once we listen and take notes, then the key here is to connect new information with old information. If you have some kind of filing system, if you were to be a psychology major, and the information I'm teaching you about memory. Let's say you take a class on cognitive psychology, and you're learning about how our brains encode and remember things. Well, then you're simply throwing it in that file and you're building on your existing knowledge base. And then long-term memories, things like photo albums. We also need to be aware of retroactive interference. This is information learned later interferes with information learned earlier. Proactive interference. Information learned earlier interferes with information learned later. So, a student studies French first and then Spanish. Spanish interferes with the French test. Also, French interferes with the Spanish test. So, to really prevent this, it would take a lot of focus, a lot of studying. Just clarifying and organizing. So when we look at how the brain works, we form long-term memories in our hippocampus, in the amygdala. So here you have the hippocampus, it's behind the amygdala, subcortex area, limbic system down here. So the engram is the physical change in the brain that occurs when a memory is formed. So the hippocampus is the area of the brain responsible for formation of long-term memories. And Alzheimer's happens because the acetylcholine here begins to break down. Acetylcholine, if you will remember, is a neurotransmitter. So there are two forms of severe loss of memory disorders caused by problems in the functioning of the memory areas of the brain. This is anterograde and retrograde amnesia. People who are in accidents in which they receive a head injury are often unable to recall the incident itself. That's retrograde amnesia. Kind of amnesia that this individual in the picture here has experienced is anterograde amnesia, loss of memory from the point of injury or illness forward. Now, Alzheimer's is a type of anterograde amnesia that happens because the acetylcholine breaks down. Now, medicine can reduce some of the illusions or hallucinations. Now, Alzheimer's patients are not psychotic. It's not a psychotic disorder, but sometimes they can believe things that will seem illogical. Usually, they're working from long-term memories. My wife's late grandmother would ask where Weldon was when I would come over to visit the family before we got married. Weldon at that point had been dead for 20 years. She was in the latter stages of Alzheimer's and couldn't remember that her husband had been deceased for 20 years, but she did remember his name and had memories. So it's as if her long-term memories were being rolled back. The key with Alzheimer's is early detection, and medicines can delay the breakdown of this acetylcholine. Well, the take-home here is if you understand how your memory works, you can remember things more effectively. It's been said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, which means it's a whole lot easier when you're in class and in a lecture to grasp and hold on to the information and to know what you don't know. The key here is to be aware that your brain drifted off when the teacher was talking about this concept. The best thing is to be studious and to hold on to this information very well. All right, well, I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I'm going to ask you in the discussion board just to talk about your studying hacks. How can you improve note-taking, recall, and storage of information? All right, take care.